Formally welcome to AYAC's National Youth Practitioner Network, or NYPN Roundtable on the Urgency of Rights-Based Youth Engagement. For those that don't know, my name is Dean Farquhar and I am the National Youth Engagement Lead of the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition. And as you have probably guessed by now, I'm not actually from Australia, so my accent can be very strong. It can go very quick sometimes when I get a bit animated. So I will try and be as slow, as considered, and as deliberate as possible so that everybody can follow along. And for those of you that do know me, I apologize for making that rubbish joke for what probably seems to you guys to be like the 10th time. So I do very much apologize for that, but I think it's good just to set everybody off with that assurance that I will try my best to be coherent and responsible. So I just want to give some background on the National Youth Practitioners Network. Essentially, we launched it last year to have another forum for sort of workshops, roundtables, or in the youth sector. We can share knowledge, share ideas, come together, do a little bit of networking, and think through really how we face up to some of the challenges that we all confront within our work. So last year we started off the year with a roundtable on social cohesion. We followed up with a workshop on youth civic and political engagement with Pip Collins. And you can find a little summary of each of those events alongside um, other great articles from practitioners within the youth sector on our accompanying sector blog, NYPN Briefing. So do check that out if you get a chance later on. So I suppose this event has been framed as the urgency of rights-based youth political engagement. So I suppose the most logical place to start is to why are we talking about the urgency? What is urgent about this work now? And to provide some context and by way of answer to that question, I'd like to share some words from Amnesty International's 2025 reports on global trends in human rights. So, Amnesty point out that their research in 2024 highlights several key themes shaping global human rights trends. These are violations of international humanitarian law during armed conflict, repression of dissent, discrimination, economic and climate injustices, and the misuse of technology to infringe on human rights. They go on to say, despite some limited positive developments, many trends represent a setback that risks being exacerbated in 2025 and beyond, as states, particularly powerful ones, continue to undermine the international rules-based system and authoritarian practices spread across different continents. So essentially, we are living in a time of increasing polarization, dislocation, and conflict that is destabilizing some of these human rights commitments, frameworks, and institutions through which they are realized and protected. And I think as well, although there is quite a lot going on in the world, it's important that we sort of turn our attention to Australia and what we are doing here because there is much that we can be doing to realize, embed, and advance the rights of young people here. And that's really what we're hoping to tease out with today's discussion is how do we advance this work in a time that is quite challenging for human rights around the globe. And I don't want to preempt too much of what is going to be said on the panel and what issues we might address, because I don't want to put us down that really narrow route. What I am going to do is I'm going to throw over to our panel members and let them introduce themselves and explain some of the work that they have been doing around this area. So I think I'll begin by throwing over to Satara. Satara, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. And just checking that you can all hear me well. Wonderful. Lovely to be here with you all. My name is Satara. I'm Australia's Youth Delegate to the United Nations. So I suppose what that kind of looks like is that for the last year, I've been traveling across all the states and territories, talking to thousands of young people about the issues that matter most to them. And then my remit is to put all those voices in a report and a statement that gets delivered at the United Nations General Assembly in New York and to Parliament to shape policy around young people. So I've just returned from New York, having given the statement and represented young Australians on that stage. And I'm just about to head over to COP30 in Belém in Brazil to do a similar role there. So yeah, really looking forward to this panel today and to engaging with all of you.
Thanks very much, Satara. We look very much forward to hearing more about what you have to say. And I think what I'll do now is I'll pass over to Howard. Howard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Dean. Hi, everyone. Really amazing to be here. My name's Howard Choo. I'm the head of policy and advocacy at 54 Reasons, and I'm joining from Wurundjeri country. I go by he, him pronouns. Um, so in my role as head of policy and advocacy, I also hold our child rights and participation portfolio. And you will hear me speak a bit about the rights of children as well as of young people, because we're guided by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which defines child as someone aged up to 18. So just really briefly, for those who might not know about 54 Reasons, we are Save the Children's Australian Identity. The name 54 Reasons comes from the 54 articles in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we're a national advocacy organisation as well as a national service provider. We provide services across the country on this continent, across early childhood, family support, domestic and family violence, educational engagement, youth justice, migrant settlement support, and all of that's through a human rights framework. So I'll be speaking from a policy and a practice perspective, and that's probably enough from me for now.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Howard. And I'm going to pass over to Amanda, who has unfortunately had a little bit of technical difficulties this morning, but you're here with us now, Amanda. So I'll pass over to you. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Dean. And I just do also want to check that you can hear me okay. My name's Amanda Third. I co-direct the Young and Resilient Research Centre at Western Sydney University, which is a research centre that looks at how to engage meaningfully with children and young people about the very broad array of issues that they face. And then to channel their insights and experience into concrete policy and practice outcomes. It's a social and cultural research institute, but it takes very much a child rights approach to all of the work that it does. And so looking at children's broad range of rights across provision, protection, and participation. And I think what we've spent a lot of time doing is trying to work out actually what sorts of adaptations might be necessary to our systems and our processes in order to be able to better hear from children and young people and to respond to the range of issues that they experience in their everyday lives. I'm super excited to be joining my colleagues on this panel, and thanks everybody for being here.
Thanks very much, Amanda. That's fantastic. And we look very much to hearing from you as well. So I suppose the best thing to do now is just to launch a little bit into the questions. And obviously it's going to be a much more informal sort of discussion. So if things come up, just raise them and we'll work through it as best we can. So I did speak a little bit there about some of the challenge to human rights frameworks globally. And I think it's what's probably a useful thing for us to do now is to center that discussion onto Australia. So what I want to know is from your perspectives, like why is this so important that we are engaging in rights-based youth engagement? Like, what does it give young people to know that their rights are being advanced in this way and that they're being worked with in this way? But also, how does that inform different policy making processes? So, why is it urgent and important in Australia today? So, I think what I'll do is, since you were the last person to speak, Amanda, and you were the first person to catch my eye, I'll maybe pass over to you first with that question.
Yeah, terrific. Look, it's very interesting, actually, Dean. I think what we've seen over the last few years is that there has been a kind of increasing traction of child rights language in policy and practice across the nation and indeed into the region, where perhaps it has had a stronger history of uptake. But I think we are beginning to see rights-based discourses influence key policy and decisions, but I think there's still a very, very long way to go. I think really a child rights lens on things is critical because, of course, Australia is a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and needs to deliver on its obligations as a signatory. But I think beyond that, rights-based approaches really offer us a useful way of thinking about the complexity that shapes children's and young people's everyday lives and being able to consider carefully, weigh up, the various impacts on their different rights, across different domains, to make decisions that ultimately will benefit children and young people. So I guess the simpler way to put that is that if children have, broadly speaking, three kinds of rights, so provision, protection, and participation rights. And what that means in practice is that we are obligated to ensure that every child, regardless of their circumstances, it has all of the things that they need to for their basic survival and their basic care, but also they need to be protected from harm, and they have a right to participate in the decision making that impacts their everyday lives. But across the different domains of their rights, whether that's health or education or a right to protection and so on, what the rights-based framework gives us a way of doing is weighing up the various different rights that children have and trying to determine the best course of action. So I think when it comes to children, often the reflex is to go into protection mode, and indeed children can be very vulnerable and we need to look after their rights. But we need to also remember that the role of society is to raise autonomous, thinking, feeling, well-supported human beings who can thrive into the future. And so we need to be able to think about all of the other positive rights, if you like, that our decisions might impact. And a rights-based approach gives us a sort of holistic way of thinking about the whole child and all children to make those informed decisions. And in terms of what it offers children, I think it reminds children that they do have this right to be protected and to be provided for, but also that they have a very important role to play in society. And too often children's rights are overlooked in the conversations that we have about the issues that impact them. And too often, it's not just that children are left out of the frame, but also many times our decision makers are focused on short-term outcomes and short-term decisions. So, but what a rights-based framework encourages us to do is to think about children as they grow. It encourages us to think about children in the present, but also the different things they require. They require at different stages of their lives and as they grow into adults. And so I think a rights-based approach can also prompt us to think much more long-term to ensure that we're planning for the next generation and doing the right thing to deliver on their needs, rights and aspirations.
Fantastic. Yeah, and there's quite a lot in there to unpack. So I just want to pass it over to maybe to Howard. Was there anything in that when Amanda was speaking that really sparked your imagination, or that you sort of thought, oh yeah, that's kind of where we come from within our organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a lot that sparked my imagination that I really agreed with. So I think there's a really strong message, I think, in what you've said, Amanda, around the value of a rights-based approach and the way it can be a really powerful tool to ensure that we are focused on children and young people in a really comprehensive way and in a meaningful way, as well as how we might think about the value of engagement with young people. So I might build on that and reflect on that a little bit as well. Dean, so your question to us was, well, how did you put it? Why is rights-based youth engagement urgent and important in Australia? And so when I reflect on what you've just said, Amanda, I think everyone in this forum will agree. I think that youth engagement is critical, of course. And I would say a rights-based approach is a tool that can help us make sure that engagement is meaningful. So thinking about, staying at the level of big picture, playing back to you, Amanda, some of what you said, when I look at our society today, I think there's just a really profound lack of respect for young people's rights as a whole. That really manifests in how young people's interests and views tend to be overlooked when governments engage with the big challenges facing society, especially the big challenges that young people identify themselves. So poverty, cost of living, inequality and discrimination, mental health, the justice system, climate change, online environments, all these big challenges where youth engagement tends to be seen as a nice to do if it's thought of at all by governments in a comprehensive sense. So for me, a rights-based approach to youth engagement is important first and foremost because it actually reminds us that young people's participation in decision-making and youth engagement, it's not optional. Of course, it should be optional and voluntary for young people themselves, but for governments and for organisations that work with young people, it's not optional, it's a right. And so it should always be an expectation and it should be for all young people. So I think that's a really powerful thing to recall. I suspect that everyone in this, online room will have had the experience of youth engagement can easily get watered down. It's really easy for organisations and for governments to start treating youth engagement as a sort of warm and fuzzy. It's a nice thing to do. You do it because it's nice, when that's not true at all, actually. So actually, it's a right to be involved in decision making. And I think a rights-based approach can be a really powerful corrective to this tendency to sort of water down, why we do youth engagement, because it's actually emphasizing accountability. So it's about governments, systems, and organizations like the one that I represent who work with young people about us being accountable, not just doing engagement to tick a box. The other thing that's going through my head is that I think a rights-based framework just gives us a really clear rationale, if we need one, for why youth engagement is important. So when I go back to the basic principles of human rights, when we think about what that's saying to us, it's saying to us that young people, just like everyone, are inherently valuable and worthwhile. It seems obvious to say it, but it's worth remembering that. Young people should be treated with dignity, should be taken seriously, are entitled to shape their own lives. And so, of course, it should be part of any decision-making process by government. Of course, there should be meaningful engagement and participation. So again, it feels for me almost a bit embarrassing to sort of say that out loud, especially in this forum, but I think it's good to remember that actually these are basic matters of rights that everyone deserves.
Yeah, and there's so much in what people are saying, particularly in that it's not a choice for governments or it's not a choice for decision makers. It's something that they have to do, but there's also something there about it actually enriching the policies and the outcomes. And maybe that'd be something that we come on and we speak about. And I'm very conscious that I'm the facilitator of the discussion, but I'm sitting here and there's lots of thoughts pinging off my brain. So, but before I bring some of those in, I want to bring in Satara, who is a young person, UN youth representative. What are you as a young person sort of feeling when you're hearing these sort of discussions? Like, what does it mean from that perspective?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because one of the things that I found is like having done the listening tour, some of the places that you go, particularly like the detention centres and remote places in Australia, um, there's a massive, it's quite an interesting disconnect between when we talk about rights in a very conceptual way, particularly in places like Parliament and even things like webinars. I think with this is the exception. I've been on a lot of webinars talking with like policy experts about, the concept of rights and what does that mean in a legal sense and things like that. But I think it's really important to remember, and going back to what has just been said, these aren't just legal documents, they're promises that we've made to children and to every young person in Australia. And I think when you are in a situation where you're, for example, sitting with a 10-year-old who's been locked up in detention in the Northern Territory, um, like there is no way that we've been keeping those promises. And it kind of takes you completely out of that framework of conceptual rights and into, these are broken promises, these are rights being violated, this is a child being harmed. And what does that mean in terms of the conventions we've signed? And I think what's really, again, what's quite interesting is having just come back from the UN General Assembly, where, the Convention of the Rights of the Child was signed, drafted, passed. Um, there is a massive disconnect between what goes on within those walls and what we see on the ground here. Um, and so I think when we talk about frameworks about human rights, I think it's important to center them on stories and experiences and what it is to be a child and a human. And I would really encourage, everyone on this call to go out and do some research, read some stories, actually understand what this means in practice. Often, like I'll talk to politicians who make policy around children's rights, but they've often never been to a lot of these communities that they legislate for. And I think that's a huge mishap in our democracy because that's not representative at all. And how are you meant to legislate effectively around rights if you don't know whose rights there are and who's what's being broken? Um, and so I think often, that is the trick. It's a lot of these rights get lost in translation, bureaucracy, and cracks between policy and lived experience. And so, yeah, just bringing it back to what it is to actually just be a human and be a child, I think is where, where we need to go in terms of this discussion. As well as, I agree with everything that's been said, holding governments to account. You've signed this federally as a government, you've signed this convention. Why is that not being implemented? And I guess the final thing I'll say is one of the things that's really interesting is the kind of throwing around of responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to legislate? And the biggest way that I've seen this is the difference between federal and state and territory governments. So things like, for example, youth detention, education, healthcare falls within that state and territory remit. And so the feds will often say, that's their job. We can't encroach on their autonomy or their sovereignty. But I think, to the extent where you're putting a spit hood on a 10-year-old in the NT, or, you're preventing people with disabilities from getting the access they deserve, you've signed those treaties. It's up to you to act. So again, I think breaking down those kind of bureaucratic like red lines that we've created for ourselves that means a child gets harmed is effectively, I think, the kind of thinking we need to be, yeah, going towards.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic because one of the things that we've been talking about this quite a lot with some research that we've been doing recently at AYAC, and one of the things that really sort of comes up is that disconnect that you refer to, Sarah, between these abstract principles that are there, that are embedded within these frameworks, and how we make them real through engagement processes, through legislation, through the consultations, but also by actually empowering young people to step forward and take those active roles in shaping those decisions. And I know that our follow-up question will probably go into a little bit more detail around that. But one of the things that I wanted to sort of sit with at the minute, because it's kind of come up within some of what has been said, is that sometimes when we sort of approach this as well, we can get into this idea of contending or conflicting rights. And we can also, and I think we can also get into this idea of that there's maybe this tension that exists, whether that's between parental rights and young people's rights to participate, but also between young people's rights to autonomy and to voice and to safeguarding. And we can sort of have these ideas where these different interpretations of rights and how we are actually supposed to do them. And I wanted to throw back for Howard with this because Howard at 54 Reasons, they wrote a very good sort of report that I've been sending out to everyone around approaching this as a shared framework of how we do this sort of work. So I was just wondering, Howard, at this moment, would you like to maybe speak to that report and how we can maybe have that more shared perspective on some of these issues?
Thank you, Dean. And I've got to be honest, I'm not sure which report you're referring to, although I love that you're sharing it.
Yeah, it's out there in the world.
Is this the one about communication and framing, possibly?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. So these are the questions that come up, and I think for us, when we want to communicate influentially with other people about and with children and young people, and to do that in a way that brings people along on the journey with us, then it's really important to be thinking about our language and how we approach that. So I think that in this forum, we're speaking very explicitly about children's rights and the rights of young people. We should not be afraid to use that language when speaking externally as well, but we should be thoughtful about when we're using that language, knowing that often that's not the first line in the door of the minister to make them really pay attention to you because of all these assumptions that people have, false assumptions that, oh, it's just a legal thing that lives in legislation or in Geneva, or, oh, it's something that pits different groups of rights against each other. I think what's important, as Satara said, I think is to really come back to the animating ideas underneath this, which is that ultimately human rights, including the rights of children, really express these convictions and promises that we all hold about the type of society that we should live in, where everyone is bound together, everyone has rights, but then there's a reciprocity there as well. And the power of a child rights approach or a human rights approach is that it actually gives us the tools to do that balancing and to recognize that there is no true conflict between the rights of different groups, or to the extent that there may be tension, let's acknowledge that there's a balance that can be struck in order to ensure that everyone's rights are upheld. So often it comes down to the evidence around effective communication and understanding the mindsets that people hold. So a language of we can be really powerful in speaking about society, about systems, our responsibilities, avoiding language that stigmatizes or that is deficit-based or that others young people or groups of young people. So all of this, I think, is practice and professional knowledge that probably most of us have just absorbed naturally by seeing what works, that it works to speak in a strengths-based way and to be collective and to recognize that we're all in this together and that there are solutions that are collective as well, and to avoid this thing where a finger is being pointed even implicitly at a young person or their family or their community or the culture or background that they may be part of or share in. So I think it's interesting how all of the good practice and the evidence often converges on some of those same insights. And then the power of a rights-based approach is that it really keeps it pointy and substantive for us, because it brings us back to these ideas, well, every young person has these rights without any discrimination, and that includes the right to have a say, as well as all the other rights that relate to safety and access to services and protection and so on.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that one of the great things there is that you mentioned that word acknowledge that tension, because I think part of that challenge of making these rights real is that these tensions, they exist out there in the world around how you actually deliver projects on the ground. Like as a youth worker, I've been working with young people for 10 years. These tensions, they form part and parcel of your everyday practice. And the one thing that I liked about that framing document was it gave that shared language for how we could actually move towards some form of shared visioning around basics approach of how we actually approach that. But what I want to do is I want to bring in Amanda. Like, what do you think about some of these tensions and how we maybe move towards negotiating them towards that more shared approach to the work?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Dean. And I think I just want to underscore the point that Satara was making earlier about the fact that rights are often thought of as abstract legal principles, but actually they come to life at that level of the lived experience of the living, breathing child, right? The child who works their way through various challenges and opportunities. And I think what we know from implementing a rights-based approach is that you do have to take a kind of a careful approach. You have to remember that children are incredibly diverse. They come from all kinds of backgrounds and persuasions. They also are a moving target in the sense that they're constantly growing, and that growth presents a sort of an emergence, right? Like that we have to deal with a kind of a sense of a growing, moving target, as I said. So, but in terms of like handling some of those tensions, I think often what we do when we come to a challenge facing children and young people is that we want to find simple solutions. And you've seen that kind of stuff happening around some of the youth justice decision making that's been happening in our country, but also around like the regulation of children's access to social media that's coming into effect in the beginning of December. Policymakers are often looking for those short-term, sort of quite simplistic often, solutions to the challenges that children face. And I think that the reality is that children are growing up in a rapidly transforming society. That society brings with it a whole lot of baggage, which causes challenges for children. And that as we seek to work in the best interests of children and to uphold their rights across a range of different domains, we need to remember that this is not work that will end, right? We're talking about often our society's most vulnerable population, our society's, arguably most creative and inspiring population, but that the kinds of challenges that children face as they grow are constantly evolving. And what a rights-based approach encourages us to do is to actually take a hold of the different contradictions that shape children's lives and to navigate our ways through that in an iterative and an ongoing way. So the work is never complete, and a rights-based approach sort of provides you with a bit of a compass to maneuver through that child's environment and make decisions that are going to best support them, whether that's an individual child or a child or children as a collective. But in terms of that balancing act, I think what we need to remember is that children's rights are what we call indivisible, right? They have to all be advanced together. There is no hierarchy of rights. One of the things that I often see happening in public policy conversations and even in practice-based work is that particular rights are cherry-picked and singled out for particular attention without due consideration to the ways that those rights then intersect with children's other rights, right? And so I guess, and what we often see is that particular rights are pitted against other rights in the public conversation. But the reality is that we must advance all of those rights alongside one another. We must make our best effort to ensure that we are making progress on all of children's rights simultaneously. And so I guess the constant challenge is to avoid the tendency to focus in on one specific right and to constantly keep that complex array of rights in the picture. That's really hard because political interests or economic interests often encourage us to sort of, as I say, hone in on a particular right. And I guess the perpetual challenge that we need to throw back to those interests is, now let's look at the whole child in their context. How do we really think creatively about the ecosystem that sits around a child and make the micro adjustments or sometimes macro adjustments that are necessary to enable that child to realise their rights. So I think I think we often think about these as opposing rights, as tensions that we can somehow resolve. But actually, the human rights approach says these rights are in tension with us, and we have to hold those tensions as we navigate through them. Yeah, I don't know if that offers a much of a response to you, Dean, but
No, I think it does, and I think it's that will actually resonate. Just before I bring Satara into the discussion, like I think that'll resonate with a lot of practitioners, particularly youth workers out there, or people who are maybe working with young people in different contexts, other than traditional youth work, because a lot of what you're doing in your practice anyway is balancing different demands and needs and aspirations, and I think like what that rights-based framing gives you, and what that sort of very succinct articulation of what it actually is that we are holding all these things in tension. I think that gives practitioners that bit of confidence of here's another tool that we can use to think through some of these things when we're actually in our work. And it's okay that these things are in tension, but it's how we think through and seek support and talk about these things and bring them to the surface that's how we can advance part of this work. So I thought that was from a practitioner's
yeah.
perspective, I thought that was very relevant. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was just going to add, Dean, that I think often actually those tensions can be very generative, right? Because actually by grabbing hold of those tensions and really grappling with them and thinking about their significance for the experience of children, we can push our thinking into new spaces, right? They offer up opportunities to inspire us in new directions. And so I think rather than thinking about those tensions as problems, I mean, they are problems. We need to think about them as problems to some extent, right? But rather than thinking about them only as problems, also to think about, well, what does that problem offer us about how we might maneuver differently to open up new spaces and new opportunities and potentially deliver new benefits to children.
So almost the route out of that sort of simplistic way of dealing with some of these issues that you mentioned, social media bans, spit hoods, is what Satara mentioned, is actually opening up to this idea of it becoming an ongoing dialogue, reflection, piece where we're constantly going backwards and forward. But I want to bring Satara in. Like, where are you sort of sitting within the discussion at the minute, Satara?
Sorry, I'm just coordinating my sound from my phone. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting conversation. I really liked what you said, Amanda, about like a holistic approach, because if there's one thing like I think we know, it's that it takes a village to raise a child. No one operates in isolation. And when we talk about rights specifically, I think there's an intersection of so many different areas within that framework. Like for example, I think just to take an example of it, like a young person I met in Central Australia, like just to illustrate, so they're kind of leaving home, and they're wanting to get to school, but they live so regionally and there's no bus that takes them to school, that they have to walk there. I mean, that's an infrastructure issue. Now they're at school, but they're completely disengaged because like the curriculum is so inaccessible, for their kind of learning, style. That's education. So because of that, they've left school, they're kind of wandering the streets a bit. Police see them, pick them up. They're now being locked up because they're being kind of public nuisance and they're being needed to move on. That's the justice system. And then finally, when they come back home, they're in a situation where, say, their caregiver is sick and elderly, but can't access medication because the government cuts their power card, so they can't refrigerate it. Like that's healthcare. That is the example of a child and many children that I met in particularly disadvantaged parts of Australia. I mean, that is a reflection of how many systems are attached to one child. But the thing is that none of those systems actually talk to each other. They're all separate. Government like departments exist in silos of their own. And so that child has to recount their trauma to every single one of those departments over and over again. No one is talking to each other. They can't have any kind of like, there is no kind of solution to this. And it's not effective at all. And so when we talk about rights, I mean, like, I think again, like thinking about things like the siloing of rights. I mean, you have a right to healthcare, you also have a right to education, but those two go together. You have a right to access public education, and you have a right to access public transport. Those two go together. Like, I think we often, again, like it's this holistic understanding that we need to actually push more and more. And I think, again, this comes back to like talking about where the federal government has a responsibility, because again, this isn't just a state issue of like housing, education, and so on. This is an issue of this is a holistic system of rights that the federal government is responsible for. They are responsible for the whole human, and so yeah, I think that's probably where I would say the analysis of, one particular area of rights versus like the actual kind of concept of it as a whole is an interesting discussion to have. And particularly in the context of, like conventions that we've signed. I think another thing that I'll mention is when we kind of see a lot of these conventions on the rights of the child, even the conventions on people with disabilities, I think there is now a stronger push to actually acknowledge intersectionality of experiences. So for example, I think there are, in the Disability Convention, there's a reference to particularly like Indigenous peoples, people with different racial identities. And that's really important because obviously we know they overlap. So even within these frameworks that are specific to rights, there is an acknowledgement that it's a much bigger picture, and that we need to like have those kind of nuanced conversations when we're discussing them.
Hey, Dean, can I jump in there quickly? Because I think the other thing that probably lifting off what Howard said earlier, around the ways that actually some decision makers find rights-based language difficult to get their head around, I think we probably need to call out the elephant in the room in that child rights discourse, or the idea of child rights, is actually a really radical idea. The Convention on the Rights of the Child grants children the same civic and political rights as all adults, right? And that's a wonderful thing. It's one of the pillars of the vision of the child with agency that the convention is seeking to nurture. But I think we also need to acknowledge that often that idea of an empowered, civic and politically engaged child is quite threatening to the adult population, because there's a lot of concern that children haven't developed the critical thinking or the maturity or whatever to be able to contribute to the conversation. And so I think, one of the things that we need to be really clear about is exactly what children do offer those kinds of conversations and decision-making processes. I think one of the things that I'm actually today at the Australia Pacific Youth Climate Dialogue, and I think one of the things that's come out of the last couple of days of conversation here is really that actually it's not just that young people have a right to contribute to these conversations. It's not just that they are disproportionately impacted by some of the issues like climate change, but actually also that they are the only people among us who know what it's like to grow up in this world, which is racked by very serious, often intractable challenges, and their thinking is actually critical for our capacity to be able to design solutions that can meaningfully address some of those challenges, right? That expertise needs to be really clearly articulated and asserted in order for us to realise that radical potential of the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we're seeing even with this discussion is when we engage this framework and we engage meaningfully with it, we acknowledge the tensions within it, and we view it as a tool for thinking through things. We can see how we can grapple with all these different issues and actually come towards a sense of where things might need to go or where things should need to go. And we are seeing that sort of richness and that generative nature of the framework. And just to move things maybe slightly forward, I want to sort of think a little bit now about like infrastructures and processes. So thinking now about like we've talked about federal government, state government, different levels, making sure things work across. We've also talked about youth work organizations, all the rest of it. What sort of infrastructures and processes do we need to work on to make rights real for young people in Australia? And I'll just pass this over to Howard to kick us off on this topic.
Yeah, I love this question. I love that you're pushing us to infrastructure and processes, because I think this is getting to, like there are really practical steps that can be taken to enable young people and children to claim their rights and for their voices to be heard. They exist and we should be taking them. Maybe I'm grappling with how specific I should get. I think maybe to make a general point. So I think it's really important to ensure that young people can be heard in every context where decisions are made that affect young people's lives. So for us as 54 Reasons, we often think about this in terms of layers. So decisions that are made in day-to-day work directly with young people, depending on your context, that could be, frontline youth services work or other types of work with young people. That's got to be participatory. Then our own, as an organisation, when we're making decisions and in our governance, that also needs to, the views of young people need to be supported, to be heard and meaningfully part of that. And then next layer outwards again, of course, for young people to be involved very meaningfully in government decision making in terms of policy making and setting, funding systems, all of that. More concretely in terms of what the processes and systems can look like. So again, maybe going back to my layers, we have a child rights practice framework in 54 Reasons, which is the whole organisation framework. It's supported by, thousands of pages of guidance and manuals and so on. But the basic idea is to ensure that all of our frontline work is in a rights-based way. And there's a child participation framework that sits alongside that and that has practice standards embedded within it, which are the sorts of standards I think that people will recognise, things like meeting the child where they are, for example. That's one of the 5 standards. So I can maybe share those rather than try to talk to all of them, but in a practice sense, making sure that our day-to-day work is rights-based. Organisationally, like many organisations, we have young advisors. So these are young people aged below 18 who we employ to advise us. But we've also probably more, as significantly, have defined a suite of pathways, we call them, ways in which any time a young person says anything to someone who works for 54 Reasons, we will do our best to hear that and ensure that it's synthesised up and heard by the senior management team, by our senior leadership. So whether that's through child-friendly feedback and complaints processes, which obviously looks very different than a feedback or complaints mechanism set up for adults, or it's our annual client surveys, consultation on specific topics, all of this. We gather that into a report. We treat that as data. That includes the direct views of children and young people who are our clients, and we make sure that's considered systematically. And then there's the system piece as well. So that's the other bit that I'd be remiss not to say in terms of really advocating and trying to change systems so that other non-government organisations are actually taking participation seriously. We have, late last year, we've set up the Australian Centre for Child Rights, which is really a collaborative initiative. It's set up by ourselves with our partners at SNAKE, with 3 wonderful universities, Melbourne Law School, the Children's Policy Centre at ANU, and of course the Young and Resilient Research Centre at Western Sydney. And we love having Amanda as part of our advisory committee. So that Centre for Child Rights is our vehicle to really advance the conversation about what children's rights are, why they matter, how to uphold them in practice. And we've gathered a whole lot of really practical resources for organisations to work in a rights-based way and to support participation. And so that's probably the outer layer that I would say.
Fantastic. And I had seen Shirley's message in the chat there, and I have a lot of sympathy, and I will come to that shortly. But I'm just going to pass now to get Satara's reflections on what Howard's saying.
Yeah, of course. I think when we talk about infrastructure, it's an important discussion to have because, again, it takes the kind of rights discussion out of this conceptual framework that is all about like principle and, handshakes and photo ops, and then into the kind of nitty gritty of it. What does that mean? What does policy actually look like? And I think there are just some really easy, simple ones. And the first is more civics education. I mean, like, I can tell you, most people don't even know that there is the rights of the child exist, like at least young people around Australia. No, like it's very poorly taught in our curriculums. Like, sure, there might be some schools that offer elective courses on like kind of civics and rights, but it's very, very rare. And I think that is a form of disempowerment in itself. It means a young person doesn't know that they're entitled to certain things, and they're not confident and equipped to advocate for themselves. So that's the first thing I would say, revitalizing the curriculum to make it mandatory that children know what they're entitled to. The second thing I would say is actually making like effectively, I think personally, my personal view is that we should have a federal human rights act. That's my thought, because I think that it's a good formalized mechanism in domestic law to actually allow people to bring complaints and measure that against the metric of rights that they have. But in saying that, kind of looking even at the kind of state and territory examples like in the ACT and Queensland, making sure that kind of model is an effective one. I mean, we've seen, for example, in Queensland, the government suspend the Human Rights Act. I mean, that shouldn't be something that you can do. Like, that seems very counterintuitive to having a Human Rights Act. So I think making sure, when we do have that infrastructure eventually, like touch wood, that actually is very protected, and kind of kept sacred. And the other thing I would say is that when you have structures like that, also making sure that they're accessible and easy to use for everyone. I think, for example, here in the ACT, there's, complaints mechanisms through the Human Rights Commission. But when I was sitting with young kids in detention here in the ACT, a lot of them were really struggling on how to actually access that and how to access that complaints mechanism. So making sure it's easy, accessible, that children know where to go if they need that support. So again, a lot of it is about empowerment of the child themselves. So yeah, having infrastructure around that, but also, having this kind of structural shift, where we don't treat children as, we don't infantilize them, we don't treat them as lesser beings. I think, as Amanda was saying, they have the same rights as adults. And I think the whole point of the Convention of the Rights of the Child is that they can exist independently of their parents and of adults. So treating them as autonomous beings, and that means giving them the respect of providing education, providing support that is accessible, and making sure that they, have those follow through mechanisms. I think the other thing to say is, kind of going off the point of having young people advising. I think this is a really important step. Like, I think it's great that like more companies and particularly government bodies have youth advisory groups, but I would also be careful in saying that I think it's not enough. Like, I think a lot of youth advisory groups are a bit performative and tokenistic, and often are just there kind of for the government to say that we've done something, or for companies to say that they've done something. And a lot of the time, the kind of people in those youth advisory groups are wonderful, but they're not reflective of all kids in Australia. Generally, they're in the cities. They're fairly wealthy. I think we need to make sure that if we're having that kind of, representation in these organisations and government agencies, it's diverse. You're bringing in people from a myriad of backgrounds, and their feedback is actually being implemented, and that follow-up is occurring. I think I've definitely seen many youth boards that have kind of presented recommendations but have never heard back. And so it feels very like you're kind of shouting into the void a bit. So again, it's all about having that infrastructure, but also making sure it's effective, and foolproofing it. So yeah, that would kind of be, I think, the comments I have around that one.
Fantastic. And I'll just pass over to Amanda. Amanda, over to you. And then I'll do some little concluding remarks, and then we'll come back for the Q&A a little bit later on. So Amanda, over to you.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. And look, I love this question too, because it orients us very much to the practical. And I guess I agree with the kinds of suggestions that my colleagues have been making. These are all really great and practical steps to take. But I think also we need to have institutions that are much more reflexive in their ongoing practice. And by that, what I mean is, I think that all decision-making entities need to constantly reflect on how they are making decisions, whether or not that is opening up towards young people or children's and young people's participation, and what can be strengthened and improved. I think, the comment from Shirley in the chat about young people coming in at the end of a process, it's such a classic tokenistic move. We've got to get much better at actually having institutions and organisations that can routinely interface with young people, that have ongoing conversations with children and young people over time, so that it's not about just seeking their opinions when the adults decide that it's important, but it's about actually collaboratively shaping agendas with children and young people. I think at the very practical sort of implementation level, that can feel very, very daunting, right? And I think there's often a lot of pressure on people who are trying to do child participation well to really meet a very high bar in terms of the way that they do it. And obviously, child engagement raises a host of ethical issues, among them the kinds of power dynamics that exist between adults and children themselves. But also many other different ethical challenges. And we obviously need to have ways to deal with those and make sure that we are doing the right thing by children as we seek to engage them in processes. But I think, often opening out to children and inviting children in, even in an informal way, and taking their input on how things might need to shift or change to enable their participation is is a really great way to start. But I guess also I've been really thinking a lot lately about the ways that adults use language that alienates children and young people from these processes. And actually, often if a child wants to contribute to a debate or contribute to changing an organisation in the way they do something, often they have to learn the language of that organisation or process. And so I think it is actually also recognising that we develop certain, I guess, skills and languages around particular issues, and that genuine inclusion means really thinking about how you come at those issues from a child-centered lens, changing the ways that we use our language, changing the ways we frame up, the ways we think about what the problems are, because actually often from a child's perspective, it looks incredibly different, as many of the people on the call would know, looks incredibly different to a child than it does to an organisation or a government that's trying to make a change. So so I think there's lots of space for us to play. And here I, do encourage us to think more like children, right? To actually, hold things. I mean, obviously the work we do is very serious, but we need to, in a sense, hold things a bit lightly and be willing to play with the systems and process and ways of doing that we've bedded down over time, so that we can open up towards children's ways of being, and I think we can be very creative about how we do that. Like, why doesn't an organisation that delivers services to children have a young co-CEO? Why don't we have, instead of measuring things according to criteria that adults define and set, why don't we have forms of measurement that actually look from children's perspectives at what really matters and measure according to those criteria? How can we use measurement to nudge a positive transition to enabling children's rights more broadly? So there's lots of things that we can do, and I think the only limitation on us is our, the constraints we put on our own imaginations and the constraints we put around really hearing from children and young people. So I think what I want us to do is to be much bolder, much more ambitious, and much more open to the unruliness of children's participation as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good sort of point to wrap up that discussion. And the one thing that sort of struck me when you were speaking, Amanda, was that the reality is that we actually, even within the youth sector and even within between the youth sector and young people, like we do share a bit of a language. So when I noted down Shirley's question, I said tokenism. And a lot of young people, like Satara mentioned it, a lot of other young people, that is a concern that, and that's a language and that's the way that we frame that. But we have those frameworks, we have those language. They're rooted in models of participation. That's Hart's ladder. All those things are there. We have those tools that are at our disposal. We also have things that could maybe avoid young people not being taken seriously or included at the outset. And that's having rights-based youth impact assessments across all levels of government. So there has to be some form of impact assessment. Does this influence young people? We have to have some form of consultation program. However, what Satara said was also very meaningful, which is that like there can be an over-reliance on certain engagement tools. Like YAGs can be very useful engagement tools, but they're only one. And I think Satara has sort of touched upon something that is a general sort of criticism of the YAGs, is that they only sort of bring in certain types of young people. And I think just to sort of reflect on that as we sort of move towards breakout rooms and all the rest of it, one of the things that we actually do need to maybe have a bit more of a discussion about, and I'm biased, okay? I'm a youth worker, right? I come from a community youth work background. And I think if we want to broaden out how we engage with young people, particularly young people who are marginalised or find it difficult to see themselves in these institutions, we do need to make a case of investing in community youth work. We have engagement techniques that can bring young people along, informal, relational learning, building up social connections, building up confidence. And if we want to supplement those more formal youth advisory group tools, we need to supplement them with more informal based ways of working with young people. And I think there is a real space for youth work there. And I think with youth workers on the call, that is a space that we can maybe step into more and use these frameworks to advance our work. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort of pause this discussion and I'm going to pass over to James from the Australian Child's Rights Task Force because one of the things that we wanted to do today was we've had a lovely discussion. We'll also get to have a discussion amongst ourselves. I would never bring new sector people onto a call and not let them talk. I think it's cruel and unusual punishment for folks like us. So we will get a bit of a chance to have a chat, have a Q&A with the panel. But we wanted the chat to maybe be orientated towards something a bit practical because I think we all like to sort of come on and actually think that something that we've said or contributed in is a bit practical. And I sort of thought one of the things that we could do in the breakout rooms was have a little bit of a chat about how within the youth sector we might contribute to keep track of some of the things that the Child's Rights Task Force is getting up to as it moves into reporting period. So what I'll do now, thankfully for all of you guys, is I will stop talking. I'll stop rambling and I'll pass over to James. So James, over to you.
Thanks, Dean. And thank you to everyone for a really exciting discussion and really insightful. So the task force is a coalition of organisations and individuals and advocates who are really concerned about child rights in Australia. And it includes a lot of the people on this call, both organisationally and personally. 54 Reasons, AYAC, UN Youth, Amanda, are all active members of the task force. What the task force's principal purpose is picking up what Satara talked about, is looking at the broken promises that have been made. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child is one promise that 35 years ago, the Australian government made to the international community on behalf of Australia, including its children and young people, some of whom are no longer children and young people, that they would work on this radical shift that Amanda talked about. And the convention has within its terms a reporting mechanism. So there's opportunity for us to hear and slowly develop better and better practice. It's probably true to say there has been some improvements. We look at the work that 54 Reasons have done to embed child rights into their work practices. That's a really good example. The child safe standards that were developed and supported by all governments in Australia are based on child rights principles. But we also want to report back and we want to find out about better practice and we want to highlight those broken promises. So that under the convention, it's supposed to happen every 5 years. It ends up happening probably about every 7 or 8 years. But we're about to embark upon the next reporting cycle, which means over the course of the next year, we will be looking at ways to report to the UN on those broken promises for individual children, for groups of children, and to once again get from the UN committee, based on its international coverage of what happens across the world. Every nation except the United States has signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so it presents a formidable body of knowledge on how to do this, how to do it better, and ideally develop best practice. So there'll be recommendations that come back to the Australian government. One of the other things that we want to try and do in that reporting process is to report better and more effectively. Picking up, once again, one of the ideas that Satara explored, that you can't necessarily put rights experiences into boxes, is that they are intersectional, is that people have experiences that cross over different sectors. The right to education, the right to have it being supported, to have access to good family care. They're all rights, but often they intersect in the experience of young people. So what we want to try and do this time is to hear about new ways to hear those stories effectively and to be able to present them to the UN Probably it will happen in early 2027. So we've got about a year. But we want to hear from you. Youth workers are on the front line. You can give us really good insights into what the issues are, but also what are the steps that need to be taken to be able to hear the voices of children and young people more effectively in decision-making processes in every part of their lives, in their lives at school, in their lives at home, and in their interaction with services and utilities that are important parts of what support them. So that's the work that we're going to be doing over the next 12 months. And I think Dean's going to give us a couple of questions that will hopefully feed into that process. I should say also that we also have a more limited role in other human rights mechanisms. So if there are issues that are arising for young people over the age of 18, then there is also mechanisms. They're probably less developed, and there's probably a bit of a gap in the human rights approach for 18 to 25-year-olds. But that I think we should feel comfortable to open that up and include that in looking forward. So back to you, Dean.
Yeah, fantastic. So basically, wanted to do something practical. So we're entering into this reporting period. So what we know is what mechanisms or engagement tools would you like to be made available or strengthened so that you guys can feed in to the work of the task force during that reporting cycle? So in very plain ways, what ways do you want to get in touch with the task force? What ways do you want to find out more about what's going on? And how do you want to feed back and shape that reporting process? Like what would work well for your organization or for you individually to be able to sort of really get involved and find out more about what's going on, but also shape the outcomes. Also, when you enter into the breakout rooms, we sometimes say, oh, here's the big formal question. Please do get to know each other, introduce yourself, say where you're calling in from. You can share some key takeaways from the event, but do just have that sort of thought about how might I want to feed into this? How can we do that? We will get feedback from a couple of groups when we come back. However, I just want to make you guys aware, if you record your sort of thoughts around mechanisms or engagement tools in the chat, we will get that as well, and we can send that back to the Child's Right Task Force. And we'll probably also send a follow-up email to everybody who registered with the recording and stuff like that there. So you can get back in touch with us then if something comes back to you afterwards. So don't be stressing. It's just an opportunity to have a little bit more of a practical orientation towards the end before we enter into Q&A. And why use 2 or 3 words when you can use 15? It's fine. Excellent. So Nelly, do you want to open up the breakout rooms? So how might you want to get in touch, find out more about the task force and feed back into that process? There's your key questions. I was just thinking, Satara, did your phone go to the same room as your oh right, okay.
Yeah, I made sure.
I was like, that could be a bit of a mess if Satara's phone didn't go to the same place as the other one. Have we got everyone back? I'm not sure we have. I think we're still waiting on a few people. Cool. Just checking through that we've got everyone. I still don't think we've got Amanda back. I've got Heart.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm here.
You're here. Oh, fantastic. We're getting everybody back. That's okay. And there hasn't been a mass exodus after the breakout rooms, which was fantastic. You usually get a bit of an exodus when people have just had other things on and they have it on in the background. So fantastic. So just before we go to the Q&A with the panel, would anybody like to feed back with James a little summary of the conversation? If not, it's cool. We can pick up all this information later on down the line. But has anybody anything that they would like to feed back to James? Speak now or forever hold your.
James, I don't know if you can see it, but I did a little breakdown of the things that people in my discussion group were asking for. So I don't know if that's helpful, but and I hope you can see it.
Is it in the chat?
Yes, can you see it?
It might be in the other chat, Amanda. I'll forward it.
Oh, yeah.
I'll forward it
Okay.
on. That's cool. At least we've got that. That means it was useful. I'll pass over to Noma though. How's it going, Noma? Do you
Oh,
want to
yeah, it's there. Cool.
Hi. We talked a little bit
having obviously as many diverse young people as possible. There's a lot of young people from the African community, particularly. We really want to do the work, but often we're being used almost sort of like for pictures or for the sake of content, as opposed to actually being used in a way where we can actually help our communities and get to that next stage. And then we talked about like mechanisms such as not always making it Sydney or Melbourne based, trying to push it out to regional areas, or if that's not a possibility, making it online so people from those areas can really contribute. And things like just having like a chat box sort of a thing where maybe someone can feed into things that they want to say out loud, but maybe they're not confident enough to say out loud. So just putting it somewhere like in a chat and then it being sent off to your team would be great as well. A great way to utilize what young people may want to say. And then, yeah, just really having that end product. So having those young people after the end of their terms, if they're in a steering committee or whatever it may be, being able to see something that's come out of that work. So it's not just some lovely faces in a room talking. It's actually, okay, we can see actually what we've done and where it's going.
So I think that
I
James,
love that.
yeah, I think a lot of that there, James, is how we actually maybe reach out with drop-in sessions to regional, rural, remote people, actually giving them that forum to contribute. Like maybe once we have some more information together, actually just getting young people's thoughts or people within those communities' thoughts, and then developing some form of feedback mechanism or explain where it goes into that reporting process. Is that something that might be viable or?
Yeah, we can definitely look at that. And particularly, I mean, I think the point that was just made is really important, that often there are finite terms that we give young people, and yet often at the end of their term, they're just starting to get some experience and confidence and understanding. And I know AYAC is particularly aware of this, that's actually the opportunity where if a government body has set up a reference group and it finishes, we want to hear from people at the end of that reference group so they can reflect on that process and we can feed it into the reporting process. So I think that's a really, really interesting and valuable thing to do to particularly build on young people's growing experience and understanding of what adults are doing to them and how they are limiting their voice. So yeah, I reckon we should do some work around that.
Yeah, and I think one of the really sort of fun things about actually doing this work with the task force is that we're we're involving young people within their term, within whatever group it is, but they're also staying in touch with us. And that means even with our own programs outside of the advisory group, we do like Noma, who asked questions, part of campaign. And through Howard, we've been able to offer not just Noma, but a few other young people on that program an additional opportunity to feed into this sort of work. So I think that's just how we keep collaborating and making sure that those sorts of options that Noma's raising, that we're taking them seriously and trying to embed them as best we can with the resources we have. So what I'm going to do is I don't see any other hands up. So what I'm going to do is just open it out to questions on the discussion that we had before on rights-based youth engagement. James, I may be able to share email address or something for the task force where people can send in suggestions with the follow-up. Is that
Yep.
cool? Yeah?
I'll stick that in the chat.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. So has anybody got any questions for Amanda, Satara, Howard, or James? Or me if you're really desperate and you're stuck.
Um, I might just flag that we had a really nice little discussion in our group. It was really brief though, and I think we were left hanging a little bit. So I guess I know that Amali, Kayla, and Sarah all sort of brought challenges up in that conversation that might be useful to explore. But just to note that Kayla in particular also raised this question of how do you meaningfully engage with diverse children and also that dilemma of knowing that at some level your engagement with that group is never going to be representative of the whole population and how do you deal with that so and that sort of seems to have come up in what sort of Noma was talking about too, and I guess I mean, I'm keen to hear how people are dealing with that, but I think it's often just a matter of acknowledging that there are very deep constraints sometimes on the ways that we need to work, and the most important thing that we can do is be transparent about those constraints on our work, B, try to find creative workarounds to ensure that we, keep seeking diverse input. And then lastly, I think also it's about really communicating with young people themselves, like reflecting often alongside young people on how we can do that better. Again, I don't think it's something we can necessarily, I sound like the person who can't solve a problem on this call, but I don't think it is a problem that we can easily solve. In fact, I'd say that this idea of perfect representation is ultimately pretty unattainable. So what we've got to do is just keep ourselves honest about that process and keep reaching deeper, keep thinking about who we're engaging with, remaining really reflexive and communicating clearly to those that we are advising and to the young people that we're working with what those limitations are on our practice.
I definitely have thoughts, but I am the facilitator, so I will facilitate and I will ask Satara, have you any thoughts on how we make representation or deal with that problem of representation? Because you did raise it in your contribution earlier on around some of these mechanisms, they maybe only attract certain types of young people. And how do we broaden that pool out? Have you any thoughts yourself? And bear in mind, as Satara, or as Amanda said, Satara, we're all grappling with it. So we don't expect an answer. We just expect thoughts and reflections.
I think it's a really good question. And again, I think it's interesting to see like where we see a lack of representation. Because again, I think we often say we've taken the first step, we've involved young people in the process, but it's asking who those young people are and whose voices. I think the most powerful question we can ask ourselves always is who's not at the table, whose voices are not in the room, rather than who is. I think that's a really important question to ask. One thing I found that when I did my listening tour, it was a question that I really grappled with because obviously you're given a select amount of budget and you have to pick which places you go to. And obviously it's really tricky because you can't go everywhere. And so, it would have been easy and I think cost effective to say, okay, I'm in this city for this day. Any young person who wants to come, come. But I think there are so many hidden things there that actually mean the young people whose voices often need to be heard the most can't make it to that kind of forum. And I think we see this a lot with like politicians as well. The number of people I spoke to who said, a politician will like put up a flyer and say, I'm having a town hall, come talk to me about your problems. That is an extremely like inaccessible forum for so many young people for so many reasons. I mean, A, it's very badly advertised. Secondly, not every young person can make it into a physical space like that. If you have a disability, that can be really tricky. Not offering an online option is very ableist. Again, if it's in a city, which regional voices are you not taking into the room? So I think like one thing that people need to really think about when we're having youth representation in any space is, can we offer a digital option, an online option? Can we make sure that we can fly people in from regional areas? If we can't do that, do we have like an interpreter? Do we have like accessible like formats on our on in our meeting? It's really questions like that. Because I think the biggest barrier is not that young people are disinterested. It's that they're not physically not able to make it. And I think that is a really important thing to think about how we make those that more accessible. The other reflection I'll have on this is also thinking about places like Parliament. I'm in Parliament House right now, and I think it's quite striking, like walking down the corridors, how like the lack of young people in this building who aren't staffers or interns. And I think it's great to have that. Like, I think it's really good to start the process there. But when we're thinking about, ministers, people in senior positions in government who are making choices about young people, we're not seeing young people in those positions or having a voice in that. I think it's very much still a very like particular homogenous group of people that are making choices for the rest of the country. And so I think when we're talking about like, the halls of power and where that policy is made, we need young people at those levels as well. And so I would really say, rather than just having a youth advisory committee, which is very helpful, it's always great to have youth representation. Why isn't there just a committee with young people? Like, why isn't there a youth board? Why can't there be a board with young people at that board, like as part of that board? I think that's my thought. I think there are spaces that are created specifically for young people, and that's great. But in doing so, we often narrow the scope and actually pigeonhole them into, saying those things. I think one of the other things is that when you speak to young people, particularly diverse young people, they don't just have a view of themselves; they have a view of their whole community. They have a view of their grandmothers, their mothers, their fathers. They understand that world really well. And particularly, I mean, a good example of this is in the Tiwi Islands, where there's such an intergenerational connection. Young people are caring for their elderly grandparents. That is a huge role, and they can tell you all about that community fabric, and that's really important. And I think that's just important to the development of that community, not just the development of young people. So again, it's not being tokenistic with it; it's giving them that full autonomous voice. And again, in doing that, making those spaces accessible so that all young people can attend and have the ability to attend. Sorry, just some rambling on that one.
Oh, excellent. And I'll pass over to Howard, then I'll throw my 20 cents in.
Yeah, yeah, this is another conversation that I really love and that we have really grappled with. So again, probably reflecting on the experience that we've had, what we've tried within 54 Reasons as a pretty large service organization. So we have very much thought about it in terms of, yes, we've got our young advisors. That's a really important forum. So those are young people primarily with experience from our programs and communities. However, they're not fully representative, of course. And so the way we've really run in parallel with that is to really intentionally design much more accessible and relevant ways of engaging with all of the children and young people who we work with, many of whom are aged below 5 or below 8, as well as facing other challenges to showing up in ways that adults would deem to be palatable or acceptable through things like traditional youth advisory groups. And that can often take the form of engagement in ways that is based on existing relationships with practitioners and then has more creative outputs. So inviting sort of drawn and crafted responses, for example, or spoken responses, and putting that, recognizing that that is equally valid as a perspective and as involvement and participation that should be taken seriously, and also doing the work ourselves to ensure that that does not just reduce down to, oh, well, someone drew something great, that's a voice, but for it to be scaffolded and explained so that that young person or that child consents and understands for what purpose they are sharing their view in a way that's developmentally appropriate. And then importantly, lifting that into decision-making forums. So even though in those cases it may not be a 4-year-old themselves who is in an executive meeting or a board meeting, but their views are still really, truly collated, heard, and that we are then accountable back and feedback about how that voice has been acted on. It's a really messy space. I often put call outs for others who are doing similar things that go beyond youth advisory groups. It's really hard to find good examples, but we're committed to it.
And again, I'm biased. I have alluded to it already. I don't think that you can widen and deepen the terms of participation for young people without meaningful, funded, sustainably funded community youth work at the place-based level that is connected to regional peak bodies, regional organisations, and national organisations. I think you need a networked approach from the national space into the regional space into the local space. I don't think that's possible without meaningful community youth work. The long-term engagement it provides, the relationship building processes it deploys, and the confidence building and capacity building that goes on through that work. I don't think it's possible. I have worked across a whole host of advocacy policy initiatives, and I know that certain young people that I worked with wouldn't have made it into the room if they hadn't had worked with me for years before, if they hadn't that relationship. I also know that those engagement methods, and I'm not talking about Australia, I'm talking about at home, um, even them, they weren't necessarily as well suited for those young people. I had a young fella who was a mechanic who came to these things, and it was set up very much like a university seminar, which was a bit alienating for him. There was a lot of words. So we need to do better to change those spaces. We need that long-term engagement to change those spaces to meet young people where that, which was hard was saying before. However, I know that we're about to finish, but I'm going to kick the nest for a little bit for the last 5 minutes because I've a whole host of people here who are much more experienced in the Australian youth work sector and beyond than I am. And I think that we talk about inclusion and diversity a lot within this debate. But one of the things that we maybe don't talk about as much, or that I haven't seen talked about as much within these discussions, has been class. and how class actually mitigates against young people's participation. And then just as a closing reflection, I wanted to get a sense from these more experienced sort of voices in the youth sector here. Do you guys get a sense that we're maybe not speaking as enough about class in terms of who gets access to these opportunities? Satara, you're shaking your head, so I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, this is again one of my favorite things to talk about because it's so like I think Australia has such a class problem, particularly with in all areas of representation. Like I even think again, like I keep coming back to Parliament because I think it's just a perfect example of like, the concentration of power in this country. And I mean, the number of people here that have a university degree that probably went to a private school in Sydney or Melbourne, and owns like three houses, that is not representative of the average Australian, let alone the average young Australian. And I think, we don't talk about money, I think, enough in that context. And a good example of this, particularly as it relates to young people, is cost of living. So during the election, there was a massive discussion about cost of living, and the media and Parliament were really excited about talking about one kind of young person, and that was probably someone living in Sydney or Melbourne from a middle class income household. Who couldn't afford to go to college at university. I mean, that was cost of living. It's like I can't afford to like be at like, college and drink with my friends, which is again not the reason why lots of people go to college. I went to college myself, but I think it was just this framing of like young people are missing out on having fun in their lives. That's one thing. When I went to like regional Central Australia, I saw young people who were in a cost of living crisis that looked like having 14 people to a one bedroom like house. That's what cost of living looks like when you go into regional Australia. In the Tiwi Islands, it's people living in cars. Like it's things like the government cutting, again, like I was saying earlier, power cards, so you can't refrigerate your medication that literally you need to survive. That's what cost of living looks like. But again, because our media and I think our discourse is so centered around a particular class of people, we actually miss out on that representation that we were talking about earlier. And I think we really need to like recenter the voices that, dominate those discussions. I think there's a lot of hidden voices in Australia. Again, it's kind of who's not in the room that can speak to that, that we just don't hear about. And so I think, yeah, it's a massive issue. I think you're so right in saying it's often the last one on the list that gets discussed. But again, like we know that there are intersections between class and so many other issues. I mean, if you're someone who's coming from a migrant or a refugee background, you're probably going to be in a lower socioeconomic bracket to a lot of others, and that is going to impact you as well. And I think there are like, there are intersecting like compounding inequalities there. If you're, for example, we know that if you have a disability and you're on a disability pension, you can't move in with a partner. Like there are issues there. There are so many intersecting things that happen. So I think it's really important to talk about that. And we know the concentration of wealth in Australia is just massive at the top 1%. So I think it's a really needed conversation to have. And particularly as we start talking about cost of living, it's about diversifying that conversation. It kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier. You've had those conversations, you have that infrastructure, but now you've got to make it better. You've got to push it so that it's all encompassing. So yeah, that's my thoughts on kind of the class discussion.
Excellent. I'll pass over to Howard and Amanda for any little sort of final little nuggets in that one, or are we good to close out?
No, just agree.
Agree. Yeah, agree. Okay. So that's a nice way to end. We end on a point of agreement that, we maybe need to think a little bit more about class and the resources and the inequality in resource distribution if we're really meaningful about deepening access and inclusion. So fantastic. So I suppose all I have to really do here is thank everybody for coming along. Also, thank you guys for coming on, participating, sharing your perspectives with us. Again, there'll be a summary of this goes up on the sector blog, NYPN briefing. I also want to give it a plug because we want that to be like a little hub for like critical insights in the youth sector. And we know that we're starting to get more sort of interest in that blog. And we hope that if you guys are out there today and there's maybe been some thoughts that have sparked off in your head about issues you're working on and how they might be integrated or explored or explained through rights-based engagement, we'd love to hear from you. I'd love to publish it. It'd be fantastic. I'm also going to sort of direct your attention again, and this is so silly, but it's just for my reporting, for my sort of funding and stuff. If you are under 25 and you attended, can you click into that little survey I shared at the start and just click that you're here? That would be fantastic. If not, just send me an email after. It'll just help me a little bit with reporting. And finally, the last thing I want to sort of say is we are doing some research on this topic, and this roundtable and all the discussions we've had will form part of that research. But also a part of that project has been different young people from our campaign group have launched a Why Rights Matter to Us blog series on our youth blog, Raise Your Voice. So if you are a young person or you know any young people who would like to sort of engage in that discussion, please feel free to reach out to myself or at the info at AYAC account. Probably the info at AYAC account because I go back to Ireland in like 4 days, so it'll be a tight window for me to get back to you guys. But other than that, thank you very much. I actually thought this was going to be a fun event. It was a fun event. Well, it was fun for me. Hopefully, it was for you. And we hope to see you guys at the next one as well. Okay, all the best. See you later.